I want to be clear about something before this board proceeds any further with Senior Coordinator Sovath's documentation, because I've read the summary she submitted, and there are several points in there that suggest I was doing something deliberately, and I wasn't. I was cleaning pens. That's what I was assigned to do. If something else happened as a result of that, I can only tell you what I actually did, not what the Behavioral Compliance Office decided it meant. My name is Davan Kors. I've held a compact grade 3 enclosure maintenance certification for 22 years. Before Forward Post Vethal, I was at Outer Station Drevak for 11 years, and before that I was at the Corindal Basin Resupply Hub for 8. I've cleaned pens for 31 years. I've worked around staging animals of 11 different compact registered classifications, including 2 terminus grade. I've never filed for a handler certification, and I've never wanted one. What I do is maintenance. I show up, I assess the space, I do what needs doing, and I go home. That's the job. I'm telling the board this not because I think my record is particularly impressive, but because I want the board to understand that the situation at the Eastern Pen Block is not, from my standpoint, unusual. I've been in a lot of enclosures. What happened at Vethal was quieter than most. I arrived at Forward Post Vethal on the 14th of the 3rd month. I was assigned to the Eastern holding pens as a temporary fill, which is standard when certified handlers rotate out faster than the registry can replace them. Compact Garrison operations typically plugs the enclosure maintenance gap with a grade 3 on a short contract. My job was to maintain the enclosures, not the animals. Feed delivery was handled by a separate supply team on a timed schedule. What I was responsible for was structural integrity, bedding rotation, waste management, water system checks. I've done it 1,000 times. The Vorreth situation was explained to me at intake by Garrison Administrator Pellet, who was thorough and clearly tired. He told me 3 certified Vorreth handlers had rotated out in the previous 6 weeks, 2 of them ahead of their contracted end dates. He told me there had been 2 safety violations filed, that the Behavioral Compliance Officer had initiated an enclosure modification review, and that the juveniles were, in his words, currently non-compliant with every standard approach protocol. He asked me whether I had any prior experience with Vorreth. I told him I'd worked adjacent to a bonded adult pair at Drevak for 3 years and had never had a problem. He looked at me the way people look at you when they're not sure whether to be relieved or more worried, and then he showed me to the eastern yard. I should describe what I saw, because I think it's relevant to understanding what happened later. The eastern holding pens at Forward Post Vethal are arranged along a tiered rock face that was retrofitted with modular enclosure framing about 9 years ago. The Vorreth pen block occupies the northeast corner of the yard, which is the largest section. There were 7 Vorreth present, 3 juveniles, 3 adults, and 1 elder male. The adults had been separated into the middle enclosures 2 weeks prior, apparently at Senior Coordinator Sovath's recommendation, because they had been displaying what she classified as escalating territorial response behaviors when handlers attempted to access the juvenile section. The elder male had not been separated, because separation of a Vorreth elder from juveniles of his pack is a compact wildlife protocol violation. He was in the northern end of the juvenile pen, which is where he'd apparently decided to be. The 3 juveniles were Kale, Setch, and Vorn. I learned their names from the enclosure intake tags. Kale was the largest, about 180 kilograms at that point, the color of old bronze, with a darker stripe along the ridge crest plates. Setch was a female, somewhat lighter, with a ridge crest that hadn't fully hardened yet, that amber-soft iridescence along the edges that you see in Vorreth juveniles before the plate calcification completes. Vorreth was the youngest of the three, maybe 140 kilograms, and she had this habit of flattening herself along the second platform ledge in the enclosure and watching things from above. I noticed that on the first day, the elder male Vorreth was a different matter. At full size, a Vorreth elder male runs to about 600 kilograms and stands, when he chooses to stand fully upright, at somewhere between 3 and 3.5 meters. Most of the time, they don't stand fully upright unless they're threat displaying or territorial marking, but Vorreth had a posture that made it clear the option was always available. He was watching the yard from the north corner of the pen, and he watched me assess the enclosure for the full 40 minutes I was doing it, and he never moved. I am not given to reading things into animals that aren't there. I've been cleaning enclosures for 31 years, and I know the difference between a display posture and a resting posture, but I want the board to understand that being watched by Vorreth for 40 minutes was not a casual experience. He had a weight to his attention that was very clear. I am not going to tell this board that I wasn't aware of the situation. I've worked around enough compact registered species to understand what 3 certified handlers exiting a posting in 6 weeks indicates. But I also know that my job was the enclosure, not the animals, and that the best practice in any pen situation involving unmanaged apex classification animals is to do exactly what you're there to do, and not to introduce additional stimuli. So I did my assessment. I marked the items that needed attention, and I went to collect my maintenance supplies. Day 1, I replaced a water system coupling on the eastern wall, checked the bedding in the lower section, and swept out the waste corridor. Kale was on the center platform the entire time. Setch was on the upper ledge. Vorreth had come down from her second-level position and was sitting about 8 meters from the waste corridor entrance, watching me sweep. None of them approached. None of them displayed. Vorreth watched from the north corner, and the subsonic chest rattle that I'd been told was constant during any handler access was, in my assessment, lower than what the intake documentation suggested. Not absent, I could feel it in the floor through my boots, but quieter, the way an engine sounds when it's idling down rather than running hot. I finished what I needed to do, and I left. Day 2, I had a water manifold replacement to complete, which took most of the morning. It's detailed work. You have to get into the lower service crawl, which runs under the enclosure floor, and there's about 1.5 meters of clearance, so you're on your side for most of it. While I was in the crawl, I could hear the Vorreth moving above me through the enclosure flooring. Vorreth footfall on modular enclosure decking has a particular sound, a dense, deliberate weight shift that doesn't echo the way a lighter animal would. I counted 3 distinct footfall patterns moving in the section above me, which meant all 3 juveniles were active. The 4th pattern, slower, more deliberate, settling rather than moving, was Vorreth repositioning in the north corner. None of them came near the service access hatch while I was in there. I noted this in my maintenance log because it was relevant to the structural assessment. The crawl access hatch had shown stress marks consistent with the enclosure modification work from the previous month, and I needed to document that the hatch remained structurally sound under load conditions. What I did not note, because it wasn't my job to note it, was that the Vorreth chest rattle was completely absent while I was in the service crawl. I only realized it in retrospect, when I was writing up the day's log and trying to remember if I'd heard it. I hadn't. I'd been 3 meters below the enclosure floor, working on a water manifold, and the chest rattle, which, per the behavioral compliance file, had been continuous and escalating during all of the prior handler access events, had stopped entirely while I was in there. I don't know what to make of that, and I didn't know what to make of it at the time. I set it aside and moved on. I ate my midday ration in the supply corridor, which is adjacent to the eastern pen block. There's a bench there that the previous maintenance team had installed. It faces the pen wall, and if you sit on it, you can see through the maintenance access grill into the lower section of the juvenile enclosure. I sat there because it was the closest flat surface to the manifold work I'd just finished, and my knees were stiff. I ate my ration. Cale was visible through the grill, about 4 meters from the inner side of the pen wall, lying down with his chin on the decking. He was watching me through the grill. I watched him back. I finished eating. I went back to work. I want to be precise about something here. I did not try to interact with the Vorreth. I didn't call them. I didn't make sounds toward them. I didn't extend my hand through any access point. I've worked around enough apex classification animals to know that uninvited approach, behavior from a human toward a non-bonded pack animal, is the fastest way to create a situation, and creating situations is not part of Grade 3 enclosure maintenance. I was there to do a job. I did it. What Cale chose to do with a view through the grill was Cale's business. By the end of the first week, I had completed the water system repairs, begun the bedding rotation, and identified 3 structural items in the upper enclosure section that needed attention before the end of the month. I had also established that the maintenance window I was using roughly the first half of the morning was one the Vorreth were willing to work around. They didn't move away from the pen. They didn't approach the access points. They stayed in their established positions and they watched. And after the first day, the chest rattle that I felt through the floor when I entered was, by Friday, gone entirely by the time I reached the first maintenance checkpoint inside the enclosure. I noted this in my daily log. I did not interpret it. I noted it. Senior Coordinator Sovath's first note to me arrived at the end of week 1. It indicated that I was to proceed with maintenance activities only, that any interaction with the Vorreth must be documented and cleared through her office first, and that under no circumstances was I to feed, touch, or vocalize toward the animals. I wrote back to confirm I had no plans to do any of those things. This seemed to satisfy her for a while. Week 2 was bedding rotation, which is more disruptive than water system work because it requires moving through the main enclosure floor rather than the service crawl. The first bedding rotation session I did, Cale sat 4 meters from me the entire time, not watching from a distance 4 meters, which at his size is close enough that I could hear him breathing. Setch had come down from the upper ledge and was occupying the center platform. Vorn was in her position on the second platform, watching from above. Vorreth was in his corner. I rotated the bedding. I worked from the south wall toward the center. Cale moved when I moved, keeping the 4 meters. I noticed it after a while. Noticed it in the particular way you notice something that you realize has been happening for longer than you thought. He wasn't following me in any way that looked like following. He was just always 4 meters away in the direction I'd come from, like a slow tide. I finished the section I needed to finish and I left. The second bedding rotation session, he was 3 meters away. I ate my midday ration on the supply corridor bench again. He was visible through the grill at about the same distance from the pen wall as the previous week. His head was up this time, not down. He was watching me more directly. I ate. He watched. Setch appeared in the secondary grill view at some point. I wasn't looking when she arrived. I just became aware of her being there. Vorn I could hear on the second platform above. That particular weight placement sound she made when she settled in. I finished eating. I sat for a few minutes because my back was stiff and the bench was there. It was quiet. The yard outside was doing what Garrison yards do, supply vehicles, personnel movement, the usual transit noise, but inside the pen block it was quiet. I went back to work. I'm describing this in detail because I want the board to understand that nothing I did during this period was unusual. I wasn't attempting to establish contact. I wasn't running any protocol. I was eating my lunch and then going back to work. If the Vorreth found something in that routine that was worth paying attention to, I can only report what I observed. I can't speak to their assessment process. By the end of week 2, Setch had started sitting in the lower section during my morning window rather than on the upper ledge. Vorreth had moved from the second platform to the center platform. Vorreth had shifted his anchor position from the north corner to roughly the midpoint of the north wall, which put him about 20 meters from my standard maintenance entry point rather than 30. None of these were actions I caused. They were positions the Vorreth chose. Senior Coordinator Sovath visited the PEM block at the end of week 2. I was informed of the visit afterward by Administrator Pellet, who told me she had observed the morning maintenance window from the external viewing gallery and had expressed concern. I was not told what specifically concerned her, but her second note to me arrived the following morning. It expanded on the first. It now also specified that I was to maintain a minimum distance of 10 meters from the Vorreth at all times, unless the specific maintenance task required closer proximity, in which case I should notify her office in advance. I wrote back to tell her that most enclosure maintenance tasks require working within 10 meters of the animals, since the enclosure is roughly 12 meters across, and that pre-notification for each task would effectively require me to file a notification every morning. She wrote back to say that was acceptable and to please begin doing so. I did. The notifications were filed. The maintenance continued. Week 3, Kale was 2 meters away for the bedding rotation. I want to be clear that this made me move more carefully, not less. 2 meters from a 180 kilogram juvenile Vorreth, with uncalcified Ridgecrest plates and subsonic resonance capability, is not a comfortable working distance for a grade 3 enclosure custodian with no handler. Certification. I moved slowly. I kept my motions deliberate. I didn't look at him directly for long stretches at a time, which is standard practice with Apex classification juveniles, and not anything I had to think about. It's just what you do. He didn't approach closer. He stayed at 2 meters and watched me work. After I finished the rotation, I sat down on the enclosure decking to make notes in my maintenance log. My knees were bothering me, and standing on the full panel flooring all morning had compounded it, and there was a low barrier I could lean against just inside the pen that was roughly the right height to take some of the pressure off. I sat there and wrote my notes. KL was 2 meters away. Setch was on the center platform, which was about 6 meters to my left. Vorreth was above on the second platform. Vorreth was at his midpoint position on the north wall, watching. I wrote my notes. It took about 15 minutes. When I was done, I put my log away, got up carefully because my knees don't like cold decking, and walked to the maintenance exit. KL walked with me. Not at 2 meters, at about 1 meter, slightly behind my left shoulder, which is a position I will later learn has a specific designation in Vorreth pack movement vocabulary, though I did not know that at the time. He stopped at the maintenance gate. I went through. He sat down on his side of the gate and watched me cross the yard. I told Administrator Pellet about this because I thought he should know. He looked at me for a long moment and then asked if I'd told Senior Coordinator Sovath. I said, not yet. He suggested I might want to. I filed a notification with her office. She came to the PEM block the following morning and watched the maintenance window from the external gallery. I know she was there because I could see her reflection in the upper observation panel. I did what I always did. Kale was 1 meter behind my left shoulder for most of the session. When I sat down to write my notes, Sech came off the center platform and lay down about 3 meters to my right. Vorn descended from the second platform to the center platform and watched from there. Vorreth walked from the north midpoint to about 10 meters from where I was sitting and settled. Senior Coordinator Vorreth filed her first reassignment protocol that afternoon. I should explain what a reassignment protocol is, for the record. Under Compact Garrison Operations Guidelines, a reassignment protocol is a formal request to remove a specific assigned personnel from a specific duty post on the basis of documented welfare, compliance, or operational concerns. It requires supporting documentation, countersignature from the post administrator, and review by the relevant operations board within 30 days. Senior Coordinator Vorreth's protocol cited unauthorized proximity to classified apex animals, informal bonding behavior inconsistent with Grade 3 certification scope, and potential disruption to the Behavioral Compliance Office's ongoing handler recruitment process. Administrator Pellet told me about it. He also told me he had not countersigned it yet, and that he was reviewing it. I asked him what I should do in the meantime. He said, "Keep doing your job." So I did. Weeks 4 and 5, I completed the upper enclosure structural repairs I'd identified in the first week. This required working on the second platform, which is inside the enclosure at an elevated level. It's accessed via an internal service ladder. Vorn was on the second platform when I arrived on the first day of this work. She moved. Not away from the platform, she moved to the far end and watched me from there while I worked on the near end. She was perhaps 4 meters from me for most of a 5-hour session. She did not display. She did not chest rattle. She lay flat on the platform with her chin on her forelimbs and watched me replace 2 sections of anchor plating. She watched the way animals watch when they've decided something isn't a threat, but they haven't yet decided what it is. That steady, neutral attention that looks like nothing, but is actually very careful. The second day I was up there, she was at 3 meters. The third day, she was at 2. The fourth day, she was at 1 meter, and when I sat down between tasks, she put her head down on the platform directly parallel to where I was sitting and went to sleep. Not on me, not pressed against me. Parallel, at 1 meter, eyes closed, breathing slow. She was asleep for about 40 minutes while I worked on the adjacent anchor section. When I started making more noise on the third anchor section, she woke up and shifted to 2 meters and watched from there. I wrote all of this in my maintenance log because it was relevant to structural safety documentation. An animal that weight settling on or near a platform section affects the structural load readings, and accurate readings require noting where the animal was. That's why I have such precise records of where she was each day. Not because I was tracking the bond, because I was tracking the load data. Kale met me at the maintenance gate every morning of weeks 4 and 5 and walked on my left shoulder to the work area. Sech had taken up a position in the lower section near the supply corridor grill and was present there when I ate my midday ration every day. She didn't approach the grill. She sat in the lower section at roughly 6 meters from the grill face and lay flat and watched me eat. I found this less strange than I might have expected, which I think says something about how quickly the human brain adjusts to the presence of a 160-kilogram animal watching you eat a ration pack. By the end of week 4, it was simply a feature of the lunch break. She was there. I ate. The yard noise was outside. Vorreth had moved his anchor position to 8 meters from the maintenance entry gate and sat there during the morning access window facing outward, facing the yard, not facing me. I'm told this has a specific meaning in Vorreth elder behavior that I was not aware of at the time. I noticed it only because it meant he was facing away from me rather than watching me. And after 3 weeks of being watched by a 600-kilogram elder, I found the change slightly notable. I wrote it in the log. I didn't know what it meant. It seemed like good news. Senior Coordinator Vorreth filed her 3rd reassignment protocol during week 4 and her 5th during week 5. Administrator Pellet continued not to countersign them. I asked him once why, and he said he was continuing his review. I took that to mean he didn't have an answer yet. I didn't push. He was a deliberate man, the kind who takes his time with things he's uncertain about, and I've learned over 31 years that people like that are usually worth waiting for. Week 6 was when the supply team first had difficulty reaching the automated feed dispensers. The dispensers for the Vorreth enclosures are accessed from the eastern service lane, which runs along the outside of the pen block. The feed team has a standard morning window that runs from approximately 30 minutes before my maintenance access to roughly 10 minutes after I enter the enclosure. What happened on the first day of week 6 was that when the feed team arrived at the service lane, Cale was at the interior side of the access wall, directly across from where the feed team would need to work. He wasn't displaying. He wasn't chest rattling. He was just sitting there, 1 meter inside the pen wall, at Cale's sitting height, which is about level with an adult human's chest, watching through the wall grill. The feed team lead, to his credit, did not panic. He assessed the situation, determined that proceeding with Cale in that position was outside his deviation protocols, and filed a safety deviation report. This was the correct call. Vorreth reviewed it and filed Protocol 6. What she didn't note in Protocol 6, but what Administrator Pellet told me that afternoon, was that Cale had moved to the access wall position at the same time I'd arrived at the maintenance gate. He'd crossed the enclosure when he heard me. The feed team had arrived 30 minutes before I did, during their standard window, and he had not been at the wall then. He had moved to the wall when I showed up at the gate, not toward the feed team, toward me, which happened to put him at the wall. I was informed of this. I thought about it on the walk home that evening. I don't know exactly what I concluded, but what I did the next morning was arrive at the maintenance gate 20 minutes before the start of my window, which is when the feed team was mid-dispense. Cale was in the center of the enclosure watching the feed team work. He heard me at the gate. He looked toward me. He didn't move to the wall. He watched the feed team complete their dispense and waited. When they were done and I opened the gate, he crossed to the gate. The feed team had full access. The dispense completed without incident. I wrote this up and sent it to Vorreth's office as an unsolicited clarification. She filed Protocol 7. I understand why she was concerned. I want to be clear about that. 3 certified handlers had left the posting. A 4th had declined redeployment to Vitt Hall after reviewing the intake documentation. The Behavioral Compliance Office had invested significant resources in an enclosure modification review that had not resolved the compliance issues. And here was a Grade 3 enclosure custodian with no handler certification, apparently doing from the outside something that looked like informal bonding with the animals she'd been unable to manage. That would concern me too, if I were in her position. I am not dismissing her judgment. From a compliance standpoint, what she was looking at made no sense, and when things make no sense to a compliance officer, they file protocols. That's what protocols are for. What I couldn't explain to her, because I didn't fully understand it myself, was that I wasn't doing anything. I was being present and consistent. I showed up at the same time every morning. I worked in the same patterns. I moved at the same pace. I sat in the same place to eat. I wasn't managing the Vorreth. I wasn't running any protocol. The closest thing I was doing to anything deliberate was working slowly and making my intentions clear in space, moving toward a thing before I got there, pausing before I changed direction, which is something I do around all enclosure animals because it's just good sense. But it wasn't a technique. It was habit, something I'd picked up in the first few years and never had reason to change. The Vorreth had apparently found this habit worth paying attention to. Week 7, Ko pressed his shoulder into my thigh. I was standing in the lower enclosure section, reviewing a crack in the western barrier plate that I'd identified the previous week. It was a hairline fracture, not yet structural, but it needed monitoring and documentation before I could determine whether it required immediate repair or could be held through the end of the month. I was crouched down examining the base of the plate, running my hand along the fracture line to assess depth, when Kale came and stood next to me, and then his shoulder was against my thigh, not pushing, not leaning his full weight, just contact. The way a large animal sometimes rests against something solid, not to move it, just to know it's there. I felt it from other animals over the years. It's a specific weight, a specific intention. Not threat, not demand, just acknowledgement. I stayed crouched. I stayed still. The crack in the plate was still in front of me, and I kept looking at it, because I wasn't sure what the right response was, and looking at the crack seemed like the most neutral option available. After a moment, I reached down with my left hand slowly, no sudden movement, and rested it on the top of his ridge crest. The calcification on his plates was almost complete by then. The texture was like warm stone with a slight give, like pressing on dense wood that had some flex left in it. I held my hand there for about 10 seconds. He didn't move. I took my hand back and went back to examining the crack. He stayed at my side for the rest of that morning's work session. I wrote it up in the log. I did not send an unsolicited clarification to Sovath's office this time. I filed the barrier plate documentation and noted that the fracture required repair within 14 days. Administrator Pellet told me that evening that he'd been watching from the gallery. He said, "I think I understand why I haven't countersigned those protocols." I asked him what he meant. He said he was still reviewing it. He said that sometimes reviewing something requires watching it until you understand what you're looking at. And then he approved my structural repair request for the barrier plate, and that was the end of the conversation. Protocols 8 through 11 arrived in the same week. I became aware that Sovath had begun consulting with the Compact Regional Garrison Operations Office directly, bypassing the post-level administrator review. Administrator Pellet was informed of this too, which I suspect he found professionally irritating, though he did not say so to me. What he did say was that the regional office had asked for his observations, and that he had provided them, and that a regional review was now pending. I said, "All right." He said, "Just keep doing what you're doing. What I can tell this board is what the yard looked like from inside the pen during weeks 7 through 10, because that's what I observed, and that's what I recorded. Kale at my left shoulder, 1 meter, during all enclosure access periods. He'd refined this over the weeks. It wasn't approximate anymore. It was consistent enough that I could feel him there without turning to look, the way you feel a wall at a known distance in the dark. 1 meter, left shoulder, always. When I crouched, he lay down. When I stood, he stood. He wasn't mimicking me. He was calibrating himself to me. There's a difference, and after 7 weeks, I could feel it. Searching the lower section, 5 to 6 meters, not moving during maintenance, occasionally following when I shifted sections, stopping when I stopped. She'd had taken on a particular habit of sitting at right angles to wherever I was working, which in retrospect makes sense. From a sightline standpoint, she could see both me and the maintenance approach access from that position. I noticed this pattern around week 8, but didn't write it up as behavioral documentation, only as a note on her typical position relative to the work area. Worn on whatever platform I was working on or adjacent to, 2 meters, watching. Vorn was the most consistently elevated of the 3. She seemed to prefer having height, which is common in juvenile Vorreth, and is apparently related to sightline control rather than dominance assertion. She watched everything from 2 meters above. When I was on the second platform for anchor bracket work, she was on the center platform below. When I was in the lower section, she was on the second platform above. She tracked the geometry, not the distance. Vorreth, at 8 meters from the maintenance gate, facing the yard, every morning, every session, the same position, the same direction. I had by this point begun to understand, still not fully, but the shape of it, that this was not coincidental positioning. He was the first one who decided something. The juveniles followed what he decided. I was just the thing he'd decided about. I want to linger on Vorreth for a moment because I think his behavior is the part of this that the behavioral compliance documentation describes least accurately. A Vorreth elder male's function in a juvenile pack cohort is something I had read about in the enclosure intake documentation, and which I understood in the abstract. They are designated as anchor figures, the fixed orientation point that juveniles reference for behavioral calibration. Where the elder looks, the juveniles orient. When the elder is at rest, the juveniles are at ease. When the elder is alert, the juveniles are alert. It's a very clean system, and it means that managing a Vorreth elder is, in effect, managing the juveniles by proxy. Whatever the handlers had been doing wrong for 6 weeks, Vorreth had observed all of it and communicated his assessment to KL, Sech, and Vorn continuously. They hadn't been non-compliant. They'd been calibrated to an elder's verdict that the people coming through the gate were not worth calibrating to. By week 7, Vorreth had taken up his position facing the yard rather than the access point during my entire morning window. He'd been doing it since week 3, I realized, looking back through my notes. I'd noticed it, but I hadn't understood it. He was not watching the yard because something in the yard needed watching. He was watching the yard because nothing in the yard, during my window, needed to come into the pen without his knowledge of it. He'd delegated that. He was watching the approach instead. He was, in the vocabulary I was later given by the Compact Wildlife Provisions Assessor, performing perimeter cover for a Grade 3 enclosure custodian who was replacing anchor plates and rotating batting. Protocols 12 through 15 arrived. Administrator Pellet's signature line on each of them remained blank. Week 10, Sech walked out the maintenance gate behind me. I want to be clear about the sequence of events. I had finished my morning session. I crossed to the gate, opened it, and went through. Standard exit. I closed the gate behind me, or I thought I'd closed it. I checked the closure as I always did, but the gate latch on the Eastern Vorreth pen has a mechanism that requires a deliberate secondary press to engage fully, and apparently on this particular morning I got the first press, but not the second. Because when I turned to walk across the yard, Sech was beside me. She had pushed the gate open and walked through while my back was to it. She was now standing in the open Garrison yard, which is a compact safety protocol situation, and she was standing very calmly at my side looking at the yard. She was curious, I think. She'd been watching the yard through grills and access panels for 10 weeks, and now she was in it. And it looked, apparently, like what she thought it would look like. I stood still. She stood still. The yard was not empty. There were 3 supply personnel crossing the far side and a compact logistics officer near the administrative block entrance. None of them had noticed yet. I had approximately 3 seconds before someone noticed, and the next 2 minutes became extremely complicated. I turned and walked back to the gate. Slowly. No sudden movement, no urgency. I opened the gate. I went through it. I stopped just inside the pen, and I looked at Setch. She turned and walked back through the gate, not rushing, calm, as though she'd seen what she wanted to see, and the visit was complete. I closed it properly, both presses. I heard the click of the secondary latch engaging. The logistics officer, near the administrative block, had turned around at some point during this. He was looking at where Setch had been standing in the yard. She was no longer there. He appeared to be deciding whether he had seen what he thought he'd seen. He looked at me. I was standing at the maintenance gate with my log under my arm. I gave him a small nod, the way you nod at someone across a yard when nothing in particular is happening, and I walked toward the exit. I closed the gate event out of my maintenance log with a note about the secondary latch mechanism requiring inspection and replacement, which it did. I did not file a separate incident report because, from a maintenance documentation standpoint, what had occurred was a gate latch failure, not a behavioral event. The gate latch was replaced the following morning by the facilities team. I reviewed the replacement and confirmed both presses engaged cleanly before I signed off on the work order. Vorreth filed protocols 16 and 17 based on the logistics officer's report. I am not certain exactly what he told her, but I assume it was more or less accurate. He'd seen a 160-kilogram juvenile Vorreth standing unconstrained in the Garrison yard for approximately 45 seconds and then walk back into the pen when a grade 3 maintenance custodian went back through the gate. That's what happened. I don't know how he classified it. Administrator Pellet called me into his office after Protocol 17 arrived. He told me the compact regional garrison operations office had formally requested a review board convened at the post, and that the review board would assess Senior Coordinator Vorreth's documentation and make a determination regarding the Eastern Pen Block assignment. He told me the review board would need to observe the morning maintenance window directly. He told me they would be present in approximately 2 weeks. I said, "All right." He said, "Devon, you understand that if the board determines the assignment represents a compliance issue, they will reassign you and the post will begin a fresh handler search." I said, "I understand." He said, "And if they determine it's something other than a compliance issue, the protocols become void, and Senior Coordinator Vorreth's office will need to document accordingly." I didn't know what something other than a compliance issue looked like from a regulatory standpoint, and I said so. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Neither do I exactly. But I've been watching your morning window for 10 weeks from the gallery, and I think the board will see what I see, and I think they'll know what to call it when they see it." I said, "What do you see?" He said, "I see a 600-kilogram elder Vorreth watching your back every morning while you replace anchor plates. I see 3 juveniles who have not chest rattled at a human access event in 6 weeks. I see you eating your lunch every day with 3 apex classification animals sitting around you in whatever spacing they've decided is appropriate, and none of you making any particular noise about it. I see an elder who has stopped watching the person doing the maintenance and started watching everything else, That's not a compliance problem. I don't know what it is exactly, but it's not that. I said, I eat lunch there because the bench is close to the manifold work. He said, I know that. That's what I mean. The Compact Regional Garrison Operations Review Board arrived on a Tuesday. 3 board members, 2 I didn't know, and 1 I recognized as a wildlife provision specialist named Torval Sedek, who had consulted on the Drevak posting many years ago during a welfare assessment on the adult pair in subsection 4. Senior Coordinator Sovath was present with her documentation, a full binder organized by protocol number with supplementary behavioral footage from the external gallery cameras. Administrator Pellet was present. I was informed at approximately 30 minutes before my standard window start that the board would be observing from the eastern gallery and that I should proceed normally. I said, Do you need me to do anything different? The board member coordinating the observation said, Just your standard morning. So that's what I did. I arrived at the maintenance gate at my usual time. Cale was already in his position. I'd been able to hear him shift across the enclosure about 40 seconds before I reached the gate, which I'd learned to listen for over the past weeks. That particular heavy, deliberate sound of a 180-kilogram animal repositioning with intention. He was at the interior side of the gate, not at the wall, watching me come across the yard. I opened the gate. He was at my left shoulder before I'd taken 3 steps inside. I walked to the first checkpoint. He walked with me. I checked the western barrier plate repair I'd completed the previous week. The new section was holding, the fracture contained, no new stress indicators. I made a note. Cale sat at 2 meters while I crouched at the plate. Setch moved from the lower section to about 5 meters off my right. Vorn descended from the second platform when I walked toward the ladder. I was going up to check an anchor bracket from the previous repair, and she positioned herself on the center platform below, where she could see both me and the enclosure entrance. Vorreth walked from his spot near the north wall to the maintenance gate position, turned, and faced the yard. I went up the ladder. I checked the bracket. I came down. I walked to the supply corridor access to retrieve a replacement fitting I needed for a secondary water coupling. Cale walked with me. All 3 juveniles moved when I moved, stopping when I stopped, keeping the spacing they'd established. Cale at the shoulder, Setch at 5 to 6 meters. Vorn slightly elevated on whatever surface let her hold that distance above. Vorreth maintained his gate position, facing the yard. I retrieved the fitting. I went back to the secondary coupling. I replaced it. I crouched down for a long period while doing the coupling replacement, and at some point, Kyle lay down next to me, which is something he'd started doing in week 9 when the morning sessions went long. Not on me beside me, half a meter away, his head on his forelimbs, watching the middle distance with that settled. Half-attentive look animals get when they've been awake since before dawn, and the morning's first urgency has passed. I worked. He lay there. Setch was behind me. Vorn was above. Vorreth was at the gate. At the midpoint of the session, I went to the supply corridor and ate my midday ration on the bench. Setch was visible through the grill, lying in her usual position in the lower section. I could see Vorn above on the second platform. Cale had not followed me to the supply corridor. He stayed inside the enclosure near the gate, which was his usual pattern during the meal break, as though he decided the gate position was more important than the bench position. Vorreth remained at the gate. I ate. The yard was outside and it was quiet in the corridor, the way the pen block is always quiet during my window, that particular absence of chest rattle that I had stopped noticing because it had become the baseline. I finished eating. I went back inside. We completed the morning session. I walked to the gate, opened it, and left. Cale walked me to the gate and stopped at the threshold, the way he always did. Vorreth turned from his yard-facing position and settled when I went through. The gate latched, both presses. I crossed the yard. The board took approximately 45 minutes in the post-administrative conference room. I waited in the yard. I sat on the supply corridor bench, which is what I usually did while waiting for things, and I looked at the pen wall, and I thought about whether there was anything left on the western barrier plate that I should have checked while I was in there. There wasn't. The repair was solid. Senior Coordinator Vorreth came out first. She walked to the bench and looked at me for a moment. I don't know what she was looking for. She had the expression of someone who has spent several months being certain about something and has just been told the certainty was right about the facts and wrong about the category. She went to the administrative block without saying anything. I don't hold that against her. It's a strange thing to have filed 17 protocols about something that turns out to not be a compliance issue. Administrator Pellet came out shortly after. Then one of the board members I didn't know. Then Torvald Sedek. Then the coordinating member. Sedek sat down on the bench next to me. He said, "It's been a long time since Drevak." I said, 11 years. He said, "I remember you were working the Drethkai pens there, subsection 4. You were there for 3 years and never had an incident." I said, "The animals in subsection 4 were manageable if you left them alone." He said, "Yes, they were. Most things are." He was quiet for a moment. The yard was moving around us. Supply vehicles and logistics personnel, the ordinary mid-morning business of a garrison post that has been in operation for a long time and expects to continue. Then he said, "What the board just reviewed is this. Senior Coordinator Vorreth's 17 reassignment protocols document a Grade 3 custodian who has, over a period of approximately 10 weeks, been assigned to an enclosure containing a Vorreth juvenile cohort classified as non-compliant under 3 successive handler rotations, and who has, during that period, apparently not experienced any compliance issues." I said, "I'm not a handler. I wasn't managing them." He said, "No. That's what we just spent 45 minutes discussing." He said, "What you have, Davan, from what we observed this morning, is a Vorreth juvenile cohort in a voluntary formation around a single individual, with the elder male in a perimeter position. That's Article 7 language. That's a compact territorial covenant formation." I said, "I don't know what that means exactly." He said, "It means the Vorreth have designated you as an anchor individual. Under Article 7 of the Compact Wildlife Provisions, an anchor individual designation by a compact registered pack species is a territorial covenant. It supersedes handler assignment, enclosure management protocols, and reassignment authority at the post level. The pack has made a determination. That determination is legally recognized. Senior Coordinator Vorreth's protocols were filed against a compliance event. There is no compliance event. There is a covenant." I thought about that for a moment. I said, "So the protocols are void." He said, "The board's determination is that her documentation accurately records events, but misidentifies their classification. She was filing compliance violations. What she was observing was a voluntary territorial covenant forming over 10 weeks. The animals were never non-compliant. They were in the process of designating an anchor. The prior handlers triggered defection responses because the animals had already begun the assessment and found them unsuitable. By the time the third handler arrived, Vorreth had been watching the gate for 4 weeks, and the juveniles were following his verdict. There was nothing a handler could have done. The role was already assigned. I said, and I was suitable because I left them alone. He said, you were suitable because you were consistent. You arrived at the same time. You worked in the same patterns. You moved at the same pace. You ate in the same place. You didn't demand anything of them. You didn't try to manage them or establish yourself or run a protocol. You just did what you were there to do in the same way, every day. The Vorreth, particularly the juveniles in a pack formation led by an elder, are documented to be highly responsive to environmental consistency. It's in the species profile. What they needed wasn't a handler. They needed an anchor, and an anchor is just a fixed point that doesn't move. You were that. You've been that for 31 years. You just never had anyone try to file a protocol about it before. I thought about what Pellet had said. I see you eating your lunch every day with 3 apex classification animals sitting around you in whatever spacing they've decided is appropriate, and none of you making any particular noise about it. The bench being close to the manifold work, the knees, the secondary latch on the gate. I said, what happens to the handler search? Sedek said, the post will still need certified handlers for the adult cohort in the middle enclosures. The juvenile cohort and the elder, under Article 7, are now under a different management framework. You'll need to formalize your status as the designated anchor individual, which requires a brief certification process. It's not a handler cert. It's a different track entirely. Anchor individual certification. The practical requirements are that you continue to maintain consistent access patterns and that you're present during any significant behavioral events involving the cohort. I said, so I keep doing what I'm doing. He said, yes. He stood up. He said, one more thing. The formation you observed this morning, KL at the shoulder, Sech and Vorn at extended guard positions, Orath at the gate facing the yard, that's a specific formation designation in the Vorreth behavioral record. It was first documented about 70 years ago at a compact staging depot in the outer Corindal corridor. It's called a compact formation, which is a slightly ironic name given that it describes a pack that has designated a non-pack individual as their primary anchor. The irony being that it looks, from the outside, very much like the animal is the one under compact management. What it actually means is the opposite. I said, what does it mean in practical terms? He said, it means that while you're inside that enclosure, no one and nothing else is getting in without the formation's assessment. And as we observed this morning, the formation's assessment follows yours, which means if you're comfortable with someone being in the enclosure, they can be in the enclosure. And if you're not, he paused, the formation will have an opinion about it. He said, you should probably be careful about which people you bring in there. He left. Administrator Pellet sat down next to me. He didn't say anything for a while. I didn't say anything either. The yard was doing what Garrison yards do, which is move people and supplies from one place to another with the particular indifference of a place that has existed for a long time and expects to keep existing. After a while, he said, you know what I think? I think that elder has been watching every person who walked into that yard for 6 weeks, and every morning when you came through the gate, he made a decision, and the decision accumulated until it was a formation. I said, what kind of decision? He said, the kind that doesn't need to be named. You showed up. You did what you said you were going to do. You came back the next day and did it again. That's it. That's the whole thing. I said, I was just cleaning pens. He said, I know. That's what I mean. Senior Coordinator Sovath's documentation was formally reclassified by the review board that afternoon. The 17 protocols were voided under Article 7 determination. She filed a professional review request with the Regional Garrison Operations Office, which is her right, and which I have no opinion about. I was enrolled in the Anchor Individual Certification Program 3 days later. The process took 11 days, most of which involved reviewing wildlife provisions law rather than any practical change to what I was already doing. The assessment reviewed my maintenance logs from the previous 10 weeks and, per the assessor's notes, found them among the most thorough behavioral documentation the regional office had seen for a Vorreth cohort in a long time, albeit generated for structural rather than behavioral purposes. The assessor found this, she said, characteristic. I passed the certification. It's a smaller document than my Grade 3 cert, and it sits in a different section of my file. The requirements are simpler. Consistent access, consistent timing, presence during significant behavioral events, which is to say, show up, do what you said you'd do, come back tomorrow. I am still at Forward Post Vethal. I am still assigned to the Eastern Pen Block. The adult cohort in the middle enclosures has a new certified handler as of last month, and from what I understand, he's doing well. He doesn't work in the juveniles section. That's not his assignment. My standard morning window starts at the same time it always has. I arrive at the maintenance gate. I can hear Kyle shift across the enclosure about 40 seconds before I reach it. He's been doing this since week 5, and I've never gotten used to how reliably he does it. The way something consistent never quite stops being notable. I open the gate. He's at my left shoulder before I've taken 3 steps. Sedge is in the lower section, and she moves when I move. Vorn is on whatever platform is adjacent to the work area, and she watches from above. Vorreth walks to the gate position, faces the yard, and watches the approach. We do the morning's work. At midpoint, I eat my lunch on the supply corridor bench, because the bench is close to the manifold work and my knees appreciate not walking farther than necessary. Sedge is visible through the grill. The yard noise is outside, and it's quiet in the supply corridor, and I eat what I brought, and that's that. Kale is near the gate. Vorreth is at the gate. Vorn is somewhere above. At the end of the session, I walk to the gate. Kyle walks me there. Vorreth turns from the yard and settles when I go through. The gate latches both presses. I check them, always, and I cross the yard to file the day's maintenance log. This morning, before I came here, Kyle put his chin on the top of my head while I was crouched writing in my log, just for a moment. His Ridgecrest plates fully calcified about a week ago, and the texture was different than I remembered from week 7. Harder, smoother, no flex left in it at all, just the clean density of finished bone. He lifted his head and went back to his position. I finished my notes. I stood up. He was 1 meter to my left, watching me put my log away with that expression animals have when they are deciding whether something is finished or whether more of it is coming. I told him I'd be back this afternoon. He lay down. I have nothing further to add to this board. My maintenance log for the full period is available if the board would like to review it. I can also provide the structural repair records, the water system service documentation, the secondary latch replacement report, and the anchor bracket assessments from weeks 4 and 5, if any of those are relevant to the board's determination. That's what I did. That's all I did. Whatever the Vorreth decided about it, that's their account to give, and I don't have the standing to give it for them.